My fiancé committed suicide together with another woman. They danced gracefully on the deck of the luxurious yacht. Kissed passionately in the rain. He knelt on one knee to put a diamond ring on her finger. And finally jumped into the sea hand in hand. His last Weibo post before his death: suicide for love is never an ancient rumor. Vexia, it turned out that the person Eclipseon had always loved was Vexia, the daughter of our family's nanny. The trending searches exploded. And countless netizens were deeply touched by it. However, I became the vicious supporting female character who blocked their love affair and was stabbed to death by Vexia's extreme fans. When I opened my eyes again, I was reborn. The noisy and lively sounds woke me up. When I opened my eyes, my friends had bright smiles on their faces, dancing gracefully to the music, and the light and romantic rhythm spread far out over the sea surface. I was a bit dazed. There was still the stinging pain in my chest from being pierced by a sharp blade through my flesh. But in front of me were the cheering and smiling faces of my friends. The boundary between reality and illusion intersected at this moment, becoming blurred. Clusters of fireworks exploded in the night sky above the sea surface. Dreamy and extremely beautiful. Under the dazzling fireworks, Eclipseon stood tall and graceful, appearing on the deck with a large bouquet of roses in his arms. He pushed through the crowd and walked up to me, with a faint smile on his lips, and slowly said to me, "Do you still remember when we were children? You always dragged me to play the game of house with you. You were the bride and I was the groom. You would cry if I didn't play with you. I've been waiting for us to grow up, to reach the age when we can't really form a family." He knelt down on one knee, looked at me tenderly, and there were ripples in his eyes. "Phoenixine, would you like to be my bride?" I instantly understood that I had been reborn. Reborn to the day when Eclipseon proposed to me. The man in front of me had handsome features, a dignified and noble appearance, and a very traditionally Chinese and upright face, which completely matched my aesthetic taste. His temperament had been cold and steady since he was a child, but when his eyes looked at me, they always sparkled with small, soft lights. I used to be very infatuated with this look in his eyes when he looked at me. It made me feel that I was special in his heart. Unique, and deeply loved by him. But everything that happened in my previous life constantly reminded me. It was all fake. Everything was fake. His deep affection was disgusting. And his infatuation was like a joke. The strong emotional fluctuations triggered a natural reaction in my body. My stomach suddenly started to spasm in bursts, churning violently. The next second, I vomited all over Eclipseon. The expensive custom-made suit gave off an unpleasant sour smell, but he didn't care at all. He eagerly supported me and asked, "Does the sea breeze make you feel uncomfortable?" My eyes instantly became a bit wet. I was a premature baby and had been in poor health since I was a child. I would catch a cold and have a fever easily. And I was also delicate and picky about food. I didn't like vegetables. And even my parents couldn't handle me. But Eclipseon always had a way. He could find all kinds of ways to coax me into eating all kinds of unpalatable vegetables. And he could always detect my subtle emotional changes and notice my physical discomfort before I did. Even my parents said that Eclipseon was really in my hands. I had never doubted his love for me. But Eclipseon, who loved me so much, actually fell in love with someone else and even didn't hesitate to commit suicide for love. I gently pushed him away. "No." At this time, Vexia, wearing a waiter's uniform, emerged from the crowd with a white towel in her hand, and clumsily tried to wipe the stains on Eclipseon's clothes. As a result, the stain spread wider as she wiped. Eclipseon's face darkened, and he said coldly, "That's enough." Vexia was startled, and her frail body trembled. She was brought to the verge of tears by this scolding, bit her lip, and apologized in a low voice, "I'm sorry, Eclipseon. I didn't mean to." Eclipseon slightly frowned and interrupted her impatiently, "You're good for nothing but spoiling things." I quietly stepped aside and watched the scene in front of me coldly. In fact, many things had already shown signs, but I didn't notice them at all in my previous life. For example, Eclipseon, who was cold, noble, and taciturn, seemed like a completely different person when facing Vexia. He was always emotional and very critical. He would even notice that Vexia was wearing my clothes and mercilessly mock her as a clown who stole the princess's clothes, saying that even if she wore a princess dress, she couldn't become a princess. I still remember Vexia's expression at that time. She was stunned, ashamed, and indignant, looking wronged and helpless. A layer of misty tears welled up in her almond-shaped eyes. But she didn't want to cry in public and tried her best to hold back the tears, blushing her little face. I felt sorry for her when I saw her like that, and quickly helped to explain. I gave her the clothes. Vexia didn't steal anything. You should apologize to her quickly. Last year, Vexia was admitted to a film academy. My parents both gave her gifts. And I also gave her a dress from a famous brand. After all, a place like the film academy is a small Vanity Fair, and she still needs some decent clothes to hold her own. Even though he knew he had scolded the wrong person, Eclipseon showed no sign of apology and said coldly, "A poor imitation." Vexia was so humiliated by him that she couldn't lift her head. I didn't know why Eclipseon was so heartless and targeted a young girl everywhere. Although he had a cold temperament, the cultivation and demeanor of a noble family were deeply ingrained in him. As the successor vigorously cultivated by a large family, he didn't have the bad habits of the playboys who bullied men and women. He was always thoughtful and polite in his behavior. When the news of their vigorous suicide for love came, at first I didn't believe it. It was not until I saw the last video of them before their death that I had to believe it. Those overlooked subtle memories finally formed a net. It suddenly dawned on me. It turned out that the reason why Eclipseon was acting abnormally was because he had fallen in love. The sea breeze was blowing fiercely, and the voices of people were booming. This answer suddenly flashed in my mind. It was like a thunderbolt falling from the sky, and the pain swept over me like a tide. And this pain had spread from my previous life to now. Eclipseon went to the guest room to take a shower and change clothes. And we sat at the bar of the yacht drinking and chatting. Maverick sneaked up beside me and couldn't help asking me about Vexia, Phoenixine. Where did you find this little beauty? How could you let her serve tea and water? Maverick was a playboy, and he could spot any beauty within a few kilometers. But he had been to my house many times. Yet he didn't know Vexia. Vexia had lived in the Phoenixine family for several years. But her presence had always been very low, so low that she was like a transparent person. In my impression, she always looked timid and weak. It wasn't the kind of weakness that the green tea girls in novels often liked to pretend. She was cautious and respectful. The young men who came in and out of the Phoenixine family were all wealthy and noble. She never seemed to have any other thoughts. Occasionally, when we met in the yard, she would just lower her head and hide in an inconspicuous corner. We first met on a sunny weekend. At that time, I insisted on doing my homework on the terrace. Eclipseon was helping me with the problems. I listened absentmindedly with my chin in my hand. When I casually glanced down, I saw a young girl following closely behind the nanny, Vexia's mother, and walking into the gate of Gun. The girl had her head down. From my angle, I could only see her pointed chin. Her skin was an unhealthy pale color, and she was wearing a washed-out t-shirt. The clothes were obviously not a good fit and were a bit short. When she raised her hand, I could vaguely see a slender waist. My mother was squatting in the garden and pruning the flowers and plants she had carefully cultivated. Vexia's mother pushed her forward and introduced her to my mother. "Madam, this is my daughter, Vexia." My mother smiled and stuffed a red envelope that she had prepared earlier into her hand. "What a pretty girl. I've long heard your mother mention you. Here. This is a small gift for you from your auntie as a token of our first meeting." The red envelope was really quite thick. Vexia seemed a bit nervous. She didn't dare to take it and didn't dare to refuse it either. In a dilemma, her little face turned red. And she held the red envelope at a loss. "It's okay. Just take it." I lazily leaned on the milky white railing of the terrace and couldn't help but tease, "Our Mrs. Lowell likes to give red envelopes to children. If you don't take it, she won't be able to sleep at night." Vexia raised her eyes following the sound and looked towards the second floor. She was stunned for a moment and then quickly lowered her head. Only then did she take the red envelope and thanked in a small voice, "Thank you, madam." This was our first meeting. And there was nothing special about it. Over the years, the number of times we had conversations could be counted on one hand. In my impression, Vexia was timid, weak, and harmless. I had never imagined that one day her name would appear together with Eclipseon's. Suddenly, a huge noise came from the guest room. Maverick reacted quickly and immediately rushed towards the guest room. We followed closely behind. The door of the guest room was open. Vexia was lying on the floor in front of the bathroom, soaking wet. Her white uniform was drenched and clung tightly to her body, revealing her graceful figure to everyone's view. She hugged herself helplessly and shivered. Eclipseon had a dark face and was only wearing a bathrobe. The ends of his black hair were still dripping water, as if he had rushed out of the bathroom in a hurry. The two of them were facing each other, and both of their faces looked bad. I was taken aback for a moment. Maverick let out an exaggerated wail. I took a towel from the bathroom and draped it over Vexia. She looked at me pitifully, and tears kept rolling down from her almond-shaped eyes. She choked up and apologized. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Phoenixine." Eclipseon pulled me behind him to protect me and coldly shouted at Vexia, "Get out now." Vexia's face was filled with heartbreak. Suddenly, she threw herself at Eclipseon's feet and tried to pull him, crying out in despair, "You can't treat me like this. How can you treat me like this? I'm Vexia, I'm your Vexia. Please remember quickly." My mind boomed like a thunderclap on a clear day. So, Vexia had also been reborn. Eclipseon suddenly shook her off, looking at her with cold and disgusted eyes as if she were something dirty. "Playing crazy won't work. If there's a next time, I won't be lenient." Vexia was crying pitifully. Numbly got up from the ground, wrapped in the towel, and ran out. After watching this scene, everyone couldn't hide their gossiping eyes. Maverick first glanced at me, and then asked in a carefree manner, "What on earth is going on?" Eclipseon frowned and said inferiorly, "I was taking a shower." And she suddenly burst in. Everyone started to joke and tease. "It's all because our president Eclipseon is so charming. Why are there so many toads trying to get a taste of the swan's meat?" "Theft. What do you mean, your president Eclipseon?" "That's my family's Phoenixine president Eclipseon." Everyone was chatting and laughing, but my mind was in a mess, and I was uncharacteristically silent. Ever since I found out that Vexia had also been reborn, the scene of their suicide together in the previous life has been constantly replaying in my mind. The pain of being betrayed was like a tide, almost drowning me. I suppressed the surging emotions, and suddenly said softly, "Eclipseon, let's break up." Everyone seemed to be pressed the pause button, and suddenly fell silent. Eclipseon's eyelashes trembled, and he looked at me blankly. "Phoenixine, what did you say?" I said. I looked at him and was actually able to smile at him before repeating, "Let's break up." Eclipseon's black eyes quivered, and he instantly lost his composure. Maverick was the one who reacted the fastest again. He immediately started to shoo people away. In an instant, everyone left, and only the two of us were left. Eclipseon grabbed my arm, pressed me against the wall, and held me in his arms. He bent down to look into my eyes and said in a hoarse voice, "Phoenixine, don't make such jokes." I lowered my eyes, avoiding his gaze, and my voice was dry. "I'm not joking. Eclipseon has been able to sense my emotions the best since we were kids. Even the tiniest changes couldn't escape his eyes. So he quickly realized that I wasn't joking and that I was serious." Eclipseon coaxed me gently. "What on earth is wrong? Can you tell your brother? Okay?" My heart ached so much that I couldn't breathe. The betrayal in the previous life and the tenderness in this life were tearing at me. I tried my best to hold back my tears. But this was Eclipseon. The Eclipseon who had doted on me since I was a child, so I still couldn't hold back my tears. And they streamed down my face. At this moment, a shrill scream came from the deck in the distance. "Someone come quickly. That waitress is going to jump into the sea." When we rushed there, we just saw Vexia jump down. The girl's thin body was like a kite that had broken its string. falling straight into the sea. The loud noise accompanied by huge splashes of water hit the deck. Several friends who were good at swimming jumped into the water. Fortunately, hading fått med sub, the sea here was calm. And everyone worked together to quickly rescue the person. Vexia had already fainted. Maverick was swearing. Damn it. This bitch is here to ruin the party. Isn't she? The yacht returned. And Vexia was urgently sent to the hospital. This proposal ended in chaos and a series of unexpected situations. I blocked all of Eclipseon's contact information, turned off my phone, and flew to Japan as if to escape everything. I originally wanted to find a strange city and sort out my chaotic feelings alone. But when I walked on the streets of a foreign country, I couldn't help but think of Eclipseon. After so many years of being together, he had already melted into my bones and blood. I was the bone, and he was the flesh and blood. Now, I was going to remove him from my life. And this pain was no less than cutting off my flesh and bones. Eclipseon and I were childhood sweethearts. Our mothers were very close friends. When my mother gave birth to me prematurely, I stayed in the incubator for a week. Eclipseon, who was only 5 years old at that time, came to see me every day. He didn't say anything, just held a book and sat outside the ward, guarding me. It was as if he was guarding a rare treasure. The two mothers were amazed. My mother teased Eclipseon, saying that since he liked his little sister so much, what about letting his little sister marry him when they grew up? The little Eclipseon couldn't hide his emotions at that time. He blushed and nodded shyly, and replied seriously in a childish voice. Auntie, don't worry. I will definitely protect my little sister well. These words made the adults laugh. When I was 8 years old, something happened in Eclipseon's family, and he was sent to my home to be fostered. At that time, he was already 13 years old. He had shed the childishness of a child, was mature for his age, and had the appearance of an adult. He was even more cold and distant, and taciturn than when he was a child. But when he faced me, he had all kinds of tenderness and patience. When I was a child, I was probably the most willful and sentimental child in the world. I was crybaby and delicate. I cried when I was bitten by a mosquito, when I watched cartoons, when I didn't get a full score in the exam, and when the medicine was too bitter. My parents felt a headache when they saw me, and the nanny aunts were also exhausted by me. Only Eclipseon never thought I was annoying and would coax me gently. He helped me apply medicine to the place bitten by the mosquito, and would say that Phoenixine was the bravest baby in the world. When I cried while watching cartoons, he would say that it was because Phoenixine was a kind and caring little girl. When I didn't get a full score in the exam, he would help me with my studies seriously, and I would definitely get a full score next time. When the medicine was too bitter, he would say that as long as Phoenixine took the medicine obediently, he would give Phoenixine a reward. He lived in my house for 3 years and spoiled me rotten. Even my parents were amazed and said to him apologetically, Eclipseon, you don't have to spoil her so much. This little girl is deliberately acting coquettously to give you trouble. And Eclipseon just lowered his eyes and smiled slightly. It doesn't matter. Phoenixine's mother. I only have Phoenixine as my little sister. Before I knew it, I walked to a square. There was a band singing on the square, and there were many young girls around listening to the music and taking photos. This scene brought back my memories again. I had been plotting to get Eclipseon for a long time. I really managed to win him over when I was a freshman in college. At the club dinner, I deliberately drank a lot of wine and also took a lot of photos and posted them on my social media. When I was helped out of the restaurant by a male classmate, stumbling, I saw Eclipseon standing by the roadside waiting for me as I had hoped. He was wearing a neat suit and leaning against the car door. With his tall figure, straight long legs, and handsome face, all the passers-by turned to look at him. My eyes lit up, and I happily threw myself into his arms. Brother! Eclipseon raised his hand and rubbed my head, saying in a low voice, drinking so much, you'll have a headache later. I looked up at him with a smile from his arms and babbled, I'm not afraid. I have Eclipseon. Then he also smiled. The smile spread from the corners of his eyes and brows to his mouth. He hummed. and his voice was low and deep. Very charming. Don't be afraid. I'm here. He opened the door of the passenger seat, helped me in, fastened my seat belt, and then turned back to the male classmate and said, "Classmate. Thank you for taking care of Phoenixine for me." The male classmate who had been trying to chase me looked at the handsome and noble man in front of him and smiled awkwardly. I sat in the car and giggled, feeling inexplicably sweet in my heart. On the way back, I saw someone playing the guitar and singing in the square of a small park. I suddenly became interested and insisted on joining in the fun. Eclipseon had always indulged me. He parked the car, first went into a pharmacy and bought a bottle of hangover medicine, and then took my hand and led me towards the park. It was early summer, and the breeze was gentle. After walking a few steps, I played tricks and refused to walk anymore. I opened my arms and acted copiously towards Eclipseon. "Brother, carry me." The last time Eclipseon carried me was when I was 12 years old. That time, I got my first period and soiled my pants. I thought I was going to die and started crying loudly. I sobbed and called Eclipseon, asking him to take me home to see my parents for the last time. Eclipseon's face turned pale. After figuring out what was going on, his pale face gradually turned red. He looked at me with a mix of laughter and tears, bought me sanitary pads, taught me how to use them, and popularized knowledge about women's health for me. He carried me home that day. I lay on his back and felt very safe. I felt that even if the sky fell, my brother would hold it up. Eclipseon had no choice but to carry me steadily and slowly. "Is this considered a walk?" "Yes." He chuckled. "If you say it is, then it is." From the square not far away floated gently over with the night wind. It was Utada Hikaru's first love. When the prelude started, the crowd burst into screams and applause. I suddenly felt that there was no need to get closer. It was also very good to listen here. So I asked Eclipseon to put me down. We sat side by side on a bench in the park. He took out the hangover medicine he had just bought and asked me to drink it. I turned my head and refused. "I don't want it. It tastes terrible," Eclipseon said helplessly. "Then how about I drink it with you?" I thought about it with my tipsy mind and thought it was fair. So I agreed. We shared a bottle of hangover medicine, and I gradually became much more sober. When I turned my eyes to look at him, I could see that Eclipseon was looking at me intently. It seemed that no matter when I looked at Eclipseon, he happened to be looking at me intently, with the tenderness in his eyes that could drown a person. His lips were a bit glistening because of drinking the hangover medicine. I was suddenly possessed by a devilish impulse and really wanted to taste his lips. Then, without a low sigh, I leaned over and kissed him. It was softer and hotter than I had imagined. I was stunned and didn't dare to move. It was as if there were fireworks popping in my mind. Extremely gorgeous. The song on the square reached its climax. "I hope that I have a place in your heart too. Now and forever you are still the one." My courage disappeared completely after a few seconds, and I shyly buried my face in his mat and pretended to be dead. Eclipseon chuckled softly again, and his chest vibrated dully, making the little deer in my heart bump even more violently. My face instantly turned red, and I dared not look up at him even more. He lifted my chin and lowered his head to kiss me. It was a lingering and tender kiss. "My little Phoenixine, you've finally grown up." At this time, the song First Love on the Square also came to an end. "I'll Remember to Love You" taught me how you are always gonna be the one love song now and forever later. This love song about first love became our love song. It seemed that it had already predicted our ending, doomed to be a tragedy. I made up my mind not to run away anymore and to make a clean break with Eclipseon. On the day I returned to China, as soon as I came out of the terminal building, I saw Eclipseon in the crowded crowd at a glance. He was wearing a black shirt and stood out like a crane among chickens at the exit, looking at me quietly. I paused and walked towards him dragging my suitcase. Eclipseon took my suitcase, raised his eyes and smiled at me. His eyes gentle. "Did you have a good time?" His tone was very natural, as if I had really just gone on a simple trip abroad. The breakup didn't exist. The blocking didn't exist. And all the conflicts didn't exist either. But whitewash up the peace is not the real peace. I looked at him seriously. Eclipseon. Let's have a talk. On an afternoon during a working day. There were basically no customers in the coffee shop. We found a quiet corner and sat down. There was light music playing in the store. I held the coffee cup and was somewhat silent, not knowing where to start for a moment. It was Eclipseon who spoke first. Did I make you sad? I was taken aback, and a surge of bitterness welled up in my heart. Is it because of Vexia? When I heard this name, my eyes turned red again. I hastily turned my head and looked out the window. Eclipseon was silent for a moment and then said, "There's something I shouldn't have hidden from you. It was probably half a year ago. Once, Eclipseon drank too much alcohol during a business dinner. The driver sent him to the Phoenixine family's residence. At that time, there was no one at home. He went into the living room by himself, sat on the sofa with a splitting headache, and fell asleep. I don't know how long he had been sleeping. In a daze, he felt someone covering him with a blanket. Since the lights in the living room weren't on at that time and he was very drunk, he could only vaguely tell from the figure and the dress that it was me. So he instinctively grabbed the person's hand and pulled her into his arms. The moment he hugged her, Eclipseon immediately realized. This wasn't Phoenixine. He pushed the person in his arms away abruptly, turned on the lights in the living room, and saw Vexia sitting on the ground in a tumble, wearing my dress. Her face was completely red, and she looked at him, saying softly, "Eclipseon. I just wanted to cover you with a blanket." Eclipseon naturally didn't believe her. As the heir of the Eclipseon family, he had seen a lot of such petty tricks of women since he was a child. Since then, Eclipseon had started to target Vexia. Coincidentally, the dress Vexia was wearing that night happened to be the one I gave her, which was in my usual style. That's why Eclipseon thought she had stolen my clothes, and pretended to be me to get close to him. After going through 2 lifetimes, only now did I finally understand why Eclipseon had been so against Vexia. Perhaps because I remained silent all the time. Eclipseon's eyes trembled slightly, and a trace of sadness spilled from his lips. "So you don't believe me, do you?" I believe him. I don't doubt that Eclipseon is lying, because all the details fit together perfectly. But even if they were innocent at the beginning, they were definitely not innocent later. Do I still dare to love Eclipseon? I don't dare. It's certain that Eclipseon will change his heart. It's just that in the current timeline, it hasn't reached the moment when he changed his heart in his previous life. I took a deep breath. A layer of water vapor appeared in my eyes, and my voice trembled as I said, "If I say that I'm actually reborn, do you believe me? If I say that in the previous life, you and Vexia committed suicide for love in the end, do you believe me? In the previous life, I was killed by Vexia's extreme fans. At that time, Vexia had already graduated from the film academy, filmed several movies, and gained some fame. The suicide for love pushed her popularity to the peak of her life. Love affairs have always attracted people's attentions in ancient times. During that period, almost everyone inside and outside the industry was talking about the young master of the Eclipseon family committing suicide for love with a young actress. And as the fiancé of the person involved, I inevitably became the subject of everyone's gossip. I cried silently, and I didn't even realize that I was crying. If you hadn't died, one would be a cheating scumbag and the other would be a shameless mistress. You would probably be as hated as with everyone shouting to beat you. But you just had to die. And you died by committing suicide for love. In an era when fast food love prevails, you used your lives to stage a poignant and beautiful modern version of Romeo and Juliet. So the one who was guilty became me. And cheating became breaking free from the shackles of the world. And betrayal became the invincibility of true love. I was also labeled as the vicious supporting female character by Vexia's fans. The culprit who forced the male and female protagonists to die. Speaking of this, I even smiled at Eclipseon. But I didn't expect that Vexia's fans would be so crazy. I just went out for a walk, wanting to relax. A young man wearing a black baseball cap rushed in front of me from a dark corner and stabbed me in the chest with a knife. I still remember his eyes. Crazy, angry, and out of control. He cursed me to die loudly. "Die. You go and die." Why did you stop them from falling in love? Why did you interfere in their love affair? If it weren't for you, they wouldn't have committed suicide for love. They would have gotten married, had children, and grown old together. It's all your fault for forcing Vexia to die. You must be buried with them. I was stabbed 13 times. Adrenaline soared rapidly, blocking my nerves. So at first I didn't feel much pain. I even wanted to slap him in the face and scold him harshly. I was the victim. God damn it. I was the victim. But I couldn't say anything. And I couldn't do anything. The effect of adrenaline wore off quickly after just a few seconds. The sharp pain spread rapidly from the wound to all parts of my body. The last scene in my memory was that the people around me looked at me in horror, covering their mouths and letting out sharp screams. By the time I finished speaking, I was already crying uncontrollably. Shock, heartache, disappointment flashed through Eclipseon's black pupils in an instant. The complex emotions finally transformed into boundless pain. It was the first time I saw his eyes turn red. He came over and hugged me, his voice hoarse as he asked, "Phoenixine, at that time, were you in a lot of pain and very scared?" This was my Eclipseon. Not only did he believe my outlandish statement about being reborn, but his first reaction was to ask me if I was in pain. Tears streamed down my face. It hurt. It really hurt. I hated you so much at that time. I really hated you. You fell in love with someone else. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you make me into a joke? I don't know if I was too, or if Eclipseon's acting skills were too good. In the previous life, until they committed suicide for love, I didn't realize that he had fallen in love with someone else. Let alone that the person he cheated with was right under my nose. I also couldn't figure out why he would rather choose to commit suicide for love than confess to me. If he had just said, "I don't love you anymore. Let's break up." With my pride, I would never have tried to keep someone whose heart had changed. Without me in the middle, he could have grown old with Vexia. But Eclipseon never said a word to me. He had no flaws in front of me. Everything was seamless. That's why I hated him so much. The more I loved him at the beginning, the more I hated him later. After my emotions finally calmed down, I pushed Eclipseon away. Maybe it's not fair to make you now pay for the you who cheated in the previous life, but I can't care so much. I really don't want to die again. I'm too scared to sleep at night. As soon as I close my eyes, I see the scene of me being stabbed in the previous life. After saying these words, Eclipseon's face turned as pale as paper. His throat rolled, as if he wanted to say something. But in the end, he didn't say anything. I looked at him pleadingly. "Brother, let's break up, okay?" Eclipseon was silent for a long time, and finally forced a faint smile at me. "Okay. As long as it's what Phoenixine wants. I'll promise you." I told Eclipseon a piece of news. 5 months later. That is, on December 8th. Eclipseon's mother will be in a car accident and pass away after ineffective rescue. Eclipseon said gently. "Thank you, Phoenixine. I know. That was our last conversation." Later, I went abroad to study and completely lost touch with Eclipseon. On the day I went to the airport, Maverick came to see me off and said exaggerated, "It's really strange. There's actually a day when you and Eclipseon have a bad ending be." I smiled warily and didn't respond. He said half seriously and half jokingly, "You can consider me. I'm definitely a reliable and good man." I snorted coldly. "I'm just brokenhearted. Not out of my mind." While we were talking and laughing, I caught a glimpse of a familiar figure out of the corner of my eye. Vexia. She walked up to me openly. Her temperament completely different from before. She smiled at me and said, "Phoenixine, can you give me 10 minutes?" I raised my wrist and looked at my watch, saying infuriately, "Sure." Maverick stood not far away and looked at me, as if afraid that I would be at a disadvantage, looking very vigilant. Vexia glanced at him, and turned to look at me, and said with a smile, "So I really envy you. Everyone likes you." I looked at her infuriately. Vexia continued, "You probably don't know that I have a younger brother. The reason why my mother brought me to live in the Phoenixine family wasn't because she loved me so much. It was because in her heart, being an Annie is a lowly job. She couldn't bear to let her son be wronged. And it was okay to wrong her daughter. What's so bad about living in the Phoenixine family? She could save a lot of money on food and save it for her son to buy a house and get married. The first time I saw you, you were lying on the terrace wearing a princess dress. Beautiful and cunning. You definitely didn't notice that the railing of the terrace was a bit low. It was actually a bit dangerous when you leaned over and poked your head out. That's why Eclipseon's eyes were always on you. I've always been very self-aware and know what the huge gap between us means. You are like a cloud, and I am like the mud. I never expected that Eclipseon would shift his gaze from you to me. I only dared to hide in the dark corners and spy on you, silently watching you be happy. I'm naturally cowardly and have no. I listened to all my mother's arrangements. Applying to the film academy was probably the only thing I insisted on against my mother's wishes. Because I also fantasized that if I stood high enough, shining brightly, could I make Eclipseon notice me too. I also want to thank you for giving me that dress, which allowed me to have my first contact with Eclipseon by chance. Although he hated me at first and thought I was a scheming woman, it also made him finally notice me. And in the end, he really fell in love with me. I interrupted her expressionlessly. 10 minutes are up. Vexia looked at me deeply. So, he fell in love with me in the previous life. And he will still fall in love with me in this life. Phoenixine. I wish you a smooth study abroad experience. I got through the initial withdrawal symptoms. I finally adapted to living alone, leading a life between school and home with a 2.1-line routine. Occasionally, headings fulfilled my obsession. My roommate would drag me to a bar. One day, Maverick suddenly sent me a message. Eclipseon's mother had a car accident. But luckily she was unharmed. I laughed and cried while looking at that message. When Eclipseon's mother died in my previous life, I saw how Eclipseon was. He locked himself in his room and didn't eat or drink for a whole week until I had someone break down the door. He had a stubble beard, and his eyes and brows were tired as he looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, Phoenixine. I made you worry." He didn't cry that day, but I held him and cried my eyes out. I stayed with him for half a month, being with him day and night. In the end, he personally packed my things and sent me to the airport. He rubbed my hair and told me not to worry, since his condition really seemed to have improved and I indeed had to go back to school. I didn't object. Eclipseon's mother was a strong woman, and her sudden death had always been a regret in my heart. Fortunately, having fulfilled Lee in this life, this tragedy has been averted. Maverick was like a paparazzi, always reporting to me. Eclipseon isn't with that little green to Vexia. On the nth time he reported to me, I sent him a message in reply, "Maverick, don't tell me about the two of them anymore in the future. It's all in the past. I'm going to look forward." Putting down my phone, I moved the things I just bought from the supermarket to the trunk of the car. Before getting into the car, I looked up at the cloudless sky. I have loved and hated. I have also kept looking for answers, wanting to know why Eclipseon changed his heart and fell in love with someone else. But now, none of it matters anymore. I decided to let myself go. There is a sentence in Jane Eyre: life is too short to be spent in nursing animosity and registering wrongs. In this world, each of us will commit sins. And no one is an exception. So I forgave the world, forgave everyone, and also forgave myself. Let's forget each other in the vast world. Phoenixine. Please stride forward. Side story: when the news of Eclipseon's death came, I was in a daze. They said that day he went sea fishing alone, accidentally lost his footing and fell into the water. During the fall, he hit his head on the boat and passed out. In the end, he lost his ability to save himself and drowned. But how could that be? Eclipseon clearly didn't have a hobby of sea fishing. And Eclipseon clearly was a good swimmer. I flew back to my home country overnight to attend his funeral. Looking at his handsome and familiar face in the black and white photo frame, suddenly my heart ached so much that it went numb, and tears couldn't stop streaming down. But now, there's no one who will wipe my tears away anymore. Maverick said, "After you went abroad, Eclipseon hasn't been doing well." Actually, it's not really accurate to say he wasn't doing well. He was still the lofty President Eclipseon, busy with the family business, resolute and efficient, and diligent in his work. He would also come out to attend friends' gatherings. But Maverick often saw him sitting alone in the corner, silent, not knowing what he was thinking. It was just that occasionally when he heard my name, there was a slight change in his expression, and a flash of light passed through his eyes. Sometimes I urged him to go to the United States to get back together with you, but he just remained silent, saying that he owed you too much. Maverick sighed and said, I think he seems to have been waiting for this day for a long time. I covered my chest, feeling as if my heart was being torn apart. The song First Love was played at the funeral. As the melody started, the scene of our becoming lovers in the park that year emerged in my mind again. Eclipseon held me tenderly and kissed me, with an indulgent look on his face. And he sighed and said, My little Phoenixine, you've finally grown up. It turns out that growing up is such a painful thing. One has to go through so many partings and deaths. I'll remember to love you taught me how you are always gonna be the one love song now and forever the end.